Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for coming today in this rainy weather. My name is Jenny Hayward-Jones, and I direct the Maya Foundation Melanita program here at the Lowy Institute. Well, welcome to this special event in our Lowy Lecture Series this year, a panel discussion on how the future state of the world will shape Australia's aid program. But before we kick off, can I just remind everyone to check that your mobile phones are either switched off or switched to silent. Thank you. You may have noticed that Australia's aid program has been in the news this month. That is, if anyone can remember what was happening before the carbon tax and the news of the world took over. On the 6th of July, the Australian government released its response to to its commissioned report of the independent review of aid effectiveness, with its own report, an effective aid program for Australia, making a real difference and delivering real results. The Lowy Institute was commissioned earlier this year to submit a study on the future state of the world as it pertained to the Australian aid program to this independent review. We were asked to forecast global strategic, economic, political and social trends that were likely to shape the development context in 2015 to 2020. This included identifying emerging dynamics in finance and trade, demography and climate, food, resources and water, and governance and institutions. Our study was published on the website last week, and there are some copies at reception available afterwards. Our research found that current patterns of poverty reduction suggest a markedly different global profile by 2020. Australia and many other donors have rightly been preoccupied with tackling poverty in developing countries to date. Over the next decade, however, current trends suggest that aid policy will be framed by significantly different challenges to those which have shaped it to date. Other development challenges, including the consequences of climate change, rapid urbanisation, overcrowding and vulnerability, food, water and energy stress, and pandemic diseases will become more pressing. Importantly, aid policy will also be affected by the shifting balance of power brought about by the rise of large emerging economies and their increasing interest in the world around them. My colleague Annmaree O'Keeffe, Research Fellow here at the Lowy Institute and a former Deputy Director General at AusAid, will chair our eminent panel today, which includes the Chair of the Independent Review, Sandy Hollway, the CEO of Karatos Australia, Jack de Grute, and the Australian newspapers, Rowan Callick. Annmaree will start the discussion on the future global development challenges that we identified in our report and consider how Australia's aid program, following the review, is placed to respond to these challenges. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jenny, and welcome everyone to today's very important discussion. I'm just going to give a bit of a snapshot of the story so far as to why the government had a review and what led to the government's response. For those of you who follow the aid story in Australia, you'll know that for the past 6 years the aid budget has actually been increasing quite substantially under both governments. It was actually started under the Howard government when in 2005 at the UN Leaders Summit he committed Australia to doubling the aid budget to $4 million by 2010. Before 2010 occurred, of course, the Rudd government came into power with a promise to actually do better than just doubling it to $4 billion by 2010, but to actually increase it to a percentage of our gross national income, a percentage of 0.5%, which meant that the aid budget would probably be doubled, depending on our national income, to about 8 to 9 billion by 2015-2016. Now, there's bipartisan support for that commitment, but behind all this, if you're going to increase an aid program so substantially, you actually really need to know what you're doing, where you're going, and how you're going to get there. And that's why in November last year, Minister Rudd asked a team headed by Sandy Hollway to actually do a review of the program as it stands, look at where it's getting it right, where it's getting it wrong, and how can it do it better, and how should it be shaped to take it forward so it could manage this, what is a massive increase in spending, and with a massive increase before that review was commissioned, what was guiding the government was the Howard government's own white paper on the aid program. And it was actually probably guiding it more haphazardly than with purpose, because it was another government's strategy. So now, 2 weeks ago, we had the launch of the review's report, I should say, headed by Sandy Hollway, and at the same time we had the government's response. The review had 39 recommendations. Of those 39 recommendations, 25 were agreed in their entirety, 5 were agreed but with some variation, usually making it even stronger. 8 were agreed in principle, and 1 was noted. The one that was noted was I think quite a minor one in terms of just changing the name of the Minister of Foreign Affairs to Minister for Foreign Affairs and International Development. The rest are far more substantial and substantive, so I think the fact that if you look at it as a report card, the response by the government to the review's report has been outstandingly positive. I'm already on the record for saying I think that the review's report was a very sound, comprehensive piece of work, and hence the fact that the government has actually responded to it in such a positive way, I think augurs well for the future of the aid program. But we're here today to hear these three talk about the future of the aid program and how it's positioned to meet the challenges which it's going to confront, without a doubt, in the next few years. And I'm going to ask Sandy if he could kick off the discussion, sort of giving us a bit of a snapshot of what his team and he saw of the program and the key areas that they identified. For those of you who don't know, and I'd be surprised if anybody in this room doesn't know, but just in case you don't, I just want to tell you that Sandy Hollway was a former secretary of 2 Australian government departments and was also the CEO of the Sydney Organising Committee for the Olympic Games. He was an official of the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for 16 years, and was also the former head of the International Division and Deputy Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. He probably doesn't remember this, but I certainly do, because I was a very young, impressionable AusAid in those days, ADAB officer, and we had a bit of a problem with a Hercules in Ethiopia, and he came to see us, and that's a very long time ago. So, Sandy, if I can ask you to come to the podium.
Thank you very much, Annmaree, and after the discussion you must tell me what we did. I can't remember the issue, let alone the action, but there we are. Thank you very much, Annmaree, and thank you all very much for coming. I'm delighted to be with you and see a number of old friends in the audience participating today. As usual, I would like to congratulate the Lowy Institute on the excellent work which it does, and in this particular case the very useful paper which we commissioned from the Lowy Institute about changes in the world in the next 5 to 10 years and how they would impact the aid program. So thank you to the Lowy Institute. From my position on today's panel, I think that the most useful thing I can do is give you a quick summation of some of the main themes of the review. I don't want to attempt to summarise the report. You can look at the executive summary or the document itself. Rather, to go at this slightly differently, I have reflected as chairman and as somebody who knows something about international aid and did know something about the subject but was not a specialist. I've reflected on what were the main themes that really came out to me as being of interest in our many months of work, and I'd like to just quickly lay out my top dozen themes. I will do this very briefly with probably just a sentence or two on each, because I understand we only have 10 minutes each and I don't want to transgress that. But of course I'm happy to elaborate when we get to the discussion period. First of all, I would say evolution rather than revolution. It is the case that the panel identified 12 issues for the aid program, 12 areas in which the program needed to improve, and these are not trivial areas. They range from lack of strategy and good budget process through to the need for improved monitoring and evaluation procedures. We refer, for example, to the need for an overhaul, not to mince words, of the budget process. But the point I wish to make is that we were, I think, fortunate as a panel and pleased as a panel to find that when we came to our work there was already very significant change underway within AusAid. Peter Baxter, as the head of that organisation, and his senior management team did not really need us to tell them that it will not be sufficient for AusAid in the next 5 years just to double what it is doing now. To be effective, it will have to do business differently. So my first point is that in many areas our recommendations are to push forward an evolutionary improvement process in the management of aid that was already underway. Secondly, I want to mention a project mentality. Now, when I lived in the United States, where they are great at bumper stickers, one of my favourite bumper stickers as I rode along behind another car just said, "Onward through the fog." I think it was a political comment at the time in Washington, but it's always stuck with me. And it just will not be sufficient if Australia is to double the aid program to proceed incrementally forward, even intelligently incrementally forward from where we are now. That's a good thing to do, but it's not enough. As a panel, we felt it was very important to have a clear picture of what an aid program at about $8 billion per annum would look like in 5 years' time, and then track back from that to see what would need to be done to accomplish that smoothly and effectively. There is much in the report about that, but suffice to say, the picture we tried to paint of what would constitute success, the target we should be aiming at, is a program directed to the alleviation of poverty as the overriding objective, an aid program that puts people first. In other words, aid is not to be seen as the passing of resources or money to countries in the abstract or other governments. There needs to be a credible pathway in every Australian aid project or program to people in need. We argue that the two criteria which should then help focus the aid program, because assuredly there's enough poverty in the world and we can't do everything, are one, where can Australia make a difference? And two, other elements of the national interest. And this leads us through many, many chapters in the report to a picture of Australian country program aid in 5 years' time at 50%, still a little over 50%, but lower than it is now. An increase in global aid through multilateral institutions and NGOs, core funding up to 20%, humanitarian and emergency assistance up to 11%, and regarding geography, still a strong Asia-Pacific focus, but South Asia up and Africa up. And the report lays out a kind of project plan for getting from here to there, and very importantly, it sets hurdles, right? Our report introduces the business notion that money just doesn't get released for more and more spending as we ratchet up. There must be a demonstration at cabinet level, year by year, that management change and hurdles which we specify have been overcome. Thirdly, and I'm sorry to be going on so long, I will try to be briefer. Thirdly, a big theme for me was bringing issues out of the closet, or I might say inconvenient truths, if that phrase hadn't been taken already by somebody else. We tried to be very assiduous in not sweeping difficult issues under the rug. Thus, for example, we say quite clearly that regional integration in the South Pacific would be far more important than aid in driving development. We say that the microstates in the South Pacific may, if we're realistic with their low economic and revenue base, virtually in perpetuity, and need to be funded by Australia in terms of basic services like health and education, if indeed the Millennium Development Goals there are to be met. We directly address an issue which is topical and sometimes controversial: should we have a human rights-based approach to aid? We talk about how risk is inherent in the aid program. Risk aversion is not the right approach. Risk management is. We talk about how the program has excessively in the past been driven by a political announcement culture. That's to say, ministers wishing to announce new programs when they travel and so on, and it should not be driven by such a culture. So that's my third point. We bring some issues out of the closet. Fourth point is innovations in methodology. I have two in mind in particular. You'll all remember, I suppose you've drawn more of them than I ever have, those pie charts that shows or purport to show where Australian tax money goes in foreign aid. And typically they would be regions of the world, and then there'd be a thumping great wedge on the pie chart that would just say global programs. We consider this to be methodologically bankrupt approach. The Australian taxpayer needs to know where the money it is putting into global programs, for example in multilateral organisations, is actually winding up geographically. And we make perhaps, I don't know, one of the first attempts, I guess, at least in an official panel, to tackle that question. The other important methodological point is that we urge the interrelationship of three things: where Australia is giving aid, what we're giving aid for, like by sectors, and how we are doing it. Now, I really, sorry that we don't have time for me to lay out the methodology, but suffice to say, we track through each of those issues and reach a conclusion in relation to each of 12 regions which we identify in the report. So, for example, bottom line on Papua New Guinea, rating on poverty, national interest and our capacity to make a difference, high. We give a scale of 1 to 5, PNG's high. Case for expansion, however, low, principally because of aid absorptive issues. Sectoral spread in a country like PNG, where Australia is a major player, would be M for medium, and the use of bilateral mechanisms would be H for high. Whereas in some other parts of the world, that pattern of case for expansion, what we're seeking to do, how much spread, extent to which we're operating bilaterally or not, would be very, very different. The fifth point I want to make I'll call consolidate or perish. A very, very big theme of our report is fragmentation and the need for consolidation. Fragmentation must be halted and reversed in our view. At present, Australian aid is in 88 countries. There are 4,500 activities going on at any one time. Astonishingly to me, there are 55 federal agencies that are involved in foreign aid. Perhaps even more astonishingly, there are 37 state agencies in Australia and state government agencies involved in foreign aid, so over 90. Now, I'm not saying, by the way, and again we can take this up in more detail in question time, discussion period, I personally would argue strongly that the internationalist impetus, mindset of Australian agencies, ranging from the Australian Federal Police and the Attorney General's Department through to the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, their instinct to get engaged with colleagues in the world is a very, very good thing. But from a management perspective, we have the fragmentation issue. So there is much in our report about consolidation. Sixth, country programs should be in the driver's seat. We believe it's been a mistake to budget by global sectors, health, education and so on, which often don't make sense when cascaded down to the circumstances of particular countries, and we believe strongly that country programs and the right architecture by country needs to be put in the driver's seat. Seventh, core funding with due diligence. We argue for a significant increase in core funding, but not, I repeat, not to every multilateral organisation or indeed every NGO. On the contrary, it must be done with very careful due diligence, and we rate multilateral organisations, for example, from at the one extreme World Bank, Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, in the good category through to outfits like the ILO and the Commonwealth Secretariat, in which we'd have much less confidence. And we argue that a concomitant of Australia giving more in core assistance to multilateral organisations must be a bigger, better, more effectively prosecuted seat at the table in the policies and programs of those organisations. Eighth, horses for courses, or to madly mix the metaphors, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. For example, it's been, I suppose, conventional wisdom that technical assistance, the use of experts, consultants and so on, can be very expensive and ineffective, and of course it can be. But there certainly are cases in which that is a very useful form of aid. And again, I can elaborate, for example, in relation to programs I saw in Vanuatu, if you're interested. Again, we must avoid any kind of knee-jerk reaction against use of partner government systems for the disbursement of Australian aid. We must be very careful which financial systems of other governments we use and how we use them, but where it works, it can be very useful in improving those systems, not just getting an aid result. In other words, we want the managers of Australia's aid to have a menu of ways of doing their business, and we want them to use whatever is fit for purpose in what they are trying to accomplish in a particular case. Ninth, the power of partnership, and you probably all say ho-hum, partnership, of course, but it is a very big theme in our report that partnership will be crucial with NGOs, multilateral organisations and others as we increase the aid vote to 0.5% of gross national income. The government simply cannot do this itself. It already is changing, and that process needs to be driven harder. In the case of working with partner governments, it should go hand in hand with an increased emphasis on mutual accountability. And in terms of NGOs, we need to engage the smaller, not just the bigger NGOs, great job though they do. A tenth, a good policy in this area is a combination of heart and head. Now this, I think one thing that is a real plus for people working in the aid area is that it's not like making widgets, not that there's anything wrong with that. It is a value-laden business. It is full of helping people in need. It is a real mission, a real passion, and I know it's a passion for colleagues here from both government and NGOs. But the passion must be combined in the next 5 years with a hard-nosed, hard-headed attitude to management efficiency and value for money. The 11th one I have is more red tape does not equal more effectiveness, and we have much in the report about streamlining of processes because we feel that there is a capacity to reduce paperwork and improve process in many other ways and get greater efficiencies. Let me just quickly mention one. There is no common evaluation method for aid in Australia across all agencies playing in this space. We advocate that there should be a single 3-tiered evaluation methodology which first of all evaluates progress against things like the Millennium Development Goals, then evaluates Australian aid contribution to that, and then evaluates inputs and outputs, evaluation of a more management kind. Now, the adoption of that sort of approach across all agencies will, for the first time, allow the Cabinet of Australia and the people of Australia to see a scorecard, a comprehensible scorecard of how we think the aid program is travelling in terms of effectiveness across all of ODA, not just AusAid. 12th, I just want to say, in the end, it's always about people. It's about the people we're trying to help overseas. It's about the staff, of course, that have to drive this program. But, and here's the important point, it's also about the Australian community. $800 million a year is given by Australians to non-government organisations who operate in the aid field. I consider that to be a very significant amount of money. We have some of the most able and active NGOs in the world. We have volunteers who go, to serve in foreign countries on development projects. So a theme of our report is community engagement and transparency, warts and all. The only way we can proceed with this program and its scale up is if nothing is hidden, good evaluations and bad evaluations. Everything needs to be put out there. The default option must always be publication. There should be very special reasons why, for example, an evaluation would not be published, and I personally find it hard to think what they would be. So transparency and community engagement. So, look, as we proceed with our discussion today, which I know is going to be mostly about how does the world affect the shape of Australia's aid program, I want to say, yes, it's true that our aid program will be shaped in part from the outside in by where the world is going, which we'll talk about, and on which we have 2 chapters in our report. But it is also going to be shaped inside out. It'll be shaped by a process of planned, strategic, focused, determined management improvement, or at least it must be, if we are to get to the goal and still have an effective program. One final comment in relation to the view that Australia is insular and complacent in international affairs. It is $8 billion per annum on aid. It is the fastest growing area of the federal budget. There is a bipartisan commitment to this very significant program overseas. Australia, when we've done this, may emerge as something like the sixth largest donor in the world. We would be increasing our effort in Asia at a time when other donors are withdrawing. There are 90 agencies, as I've said, thinking internationally and establishing openings to counterparts around the world. There's 800 million from the public, and there is a rich diversity and capacity in the NGO community. So I think it is an aid program that reflects Australian internationalism, and the only sort of aid program Australia should have, and it's one we can have, will be founded on 2 things. One is Australian values of caring and helping and sharing and decency, and the second will be a foundation on Australia's enduring national interests as a country which is actively internationalist. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Sandy. I'd now like to ask Jack de Grute to come over and talk to us from the civil society NGO perspective. Jack is the CEO of Karatos Australia, which is the international aid and development agency of the Catholic Church in Australia, and he's held that position since August 2000. He, once upon a time when the Aid Advisory Council existed, he was a member of that, and he's also very heavily involved with the Australian Council for International Development. I'd like you to welcome Jack de Grute. Thank you.
Thank you, Annmaree. Obviously, I have been around a long time because as we got out of the taxi, I remembered I think in 2005 I spoke at this lectern when the white paper on aid was released, so, or that's the paper that we don't speak its name of anymore. I wanted to make, obviously, an invitation was a few comments on the work of Sandy's review panel and the government's response. We very much welcome that in both Sandy's review and the government's response that the fundamental purpose of the Australian aid program is people overcoming poverty. And for agencies like Karatos, we're very much rooted in the local community networks and live through, in our case, the presence of church with people trying to overcome poverty. The focus on people does make a huge difference when it comes to overcoming poverty and the issues of inequality. The definition of poverty that we need to see thought through in this effectiveness paradigm that now dominates our aid language in Australia has to move beyond an access to services or better governance. It really has to be about people telling us the change that an effective aid program has meant for them. And it is through these very localised community networks, presence and community respect that we can bring about change. So an example of how we see that. In Papua New Guinea, the Catholic Church provides about 40% of healthcare services outside of Moresby. Karatos has built on a 5-year program promoting a cervical screening program. In the past year, we saw 10,000 women alone access screening, education and treatment when necessary. And through the Church's partnership program and in collaboration with AusAid, 6 other Australian churches, along with Karatos, we've established 87 voluntary counselling and testing centres in the most remote areas of PNG. What that has meant is over 100,000 women and an increasing number of men have accessed a comprehensive range of services in recent years. All of this is very much a story of a focus on those without access to services and saving lives, which are key directions in the government's response to the review. But these responses that we've been involved with are also the understanding that men and women now have of what good sexual health is and an improvement on relations between men and women. And what I'd like to say is that what is impressive in such an integrated nature of an approach that starts with people as the purpose of the aid program is you get more bang for the buck. It's a human approach that leads to a holistic approach to overcoming poverty. Our focus is on the dignity of people, not only of access to health services, but the quality of human relationship. A second reflection on the review and on the government response, and in just telling a story of PNG, is to then welcome anew the focus of the program on the Asia Pacific as our prime responsibility in Australia. It's an appropriate role for Australia. It's appropriate because of our national interest, our strategic relationships as well. But what the review also points out very well in the response is to take seriously the changing nature of the geographical realities of poverty that we've seen over the last 20 years and we see in the next 5. According to the material in the review and the response from the World Bank, by 2015 the concentration of the world's poor will continue to grow in sub-Saharan Africa, with South Asia, the 2 of those still heavily dominating as the home of the poor. East Asia and particularly the Pacific then will still have a significant number of those living in poverty, but thankfully that's a decreasing number. So the expansion of the program to Africa certainly makes sense, again in terms of meeting that foundational purpose of the aid program of people overcoming poverty. The review and the government's response throughout these last, nearly 9-10 months has never lost focus on the pursuit of an effective aid program. In many ways, the review sees good aid as something that not only focuses on poverty, but battles inequality. For an agency such as Karatos, we probably have three lenses for viewing whether aid is good. The way forward for the Australian aid program is to always go to the fundamental purpose and ask these questions. A. Does this program show evidence that it is people-centred? How were the poorest and most marginalised engaged in the vision, design and implementation and review of the initiative? What evidence do we have of change in their lives as a result of the Australian partnership? B. Does this program show evidence of a commitment to partnership? Describe the quality of the relationship, the trust. How old are these relationships? How do they enable resources and learning exchange to occur? How are the partnerships contributing incrementally and exponentially to development outcomes? And C, does the program show evidence that it is building sustainable local capacity? How are local organisations involved, both government and civil? How do local entities involved describe the results of the Australian partnership in terms of their institutional, management, governance and service delivery capacities? Well, now that I've said that of the Australian government's program, how do we at Karatos give any story of having undertaken that? In Timor, we've had an operational presence this last dozen years. In 2009, we reviewed our strategic plan and began planning for a new period. We consulted 80 community-based organisations, civil society leaders, local government, national government, other international NGOs, of course the church in my case, at both the review and then the planning stage. We'd worked and were in relationship with each of those groupings. The relationships are long, the changes for these people identifiable, the direction articulated and then owned by those communities. One of the very interesting parts of this challenge for the aid program and for all players is the ability to show evidence that effective aid that works is not always expensive by any stretch of the imagination. I'm not too sure how to meet the government's $8 to $9 billion problem because not everything costs lots of money. The Lowy paper for the review looks at the escalating frequency, severity and cost of natural disasters, particularly throughout Asia. Since 2000, global spending on disaster response has increased by nearly 60% to 11.2 billion US. It will increase. The government's response to the aid review puts a strong emphasis on such humanitarian disaster response. And the challenge that Karatos would put is this: does the focus have to rely on response? Or are we focused on disaster risk reduction and emergency preparedness as our model of understanding humanitarian disasters? DFID, in its Humanitarian Emergency Response review conducted by Lord Ashdown and handed down in March, point out the salient experience of Mozambique 5 years ago during a flood crisis and what disaster risk reduction may have achieved. Ashdown says, investment in disaster risk reduction is significantly cheaper and more cost-effective than investing in emergency response. He noted that in Mozambique, they asked the international community for £2 million in 2006 to help prepare for the flood, an amount it could not secure. After the floods, £60 million was spent on response. Sandy has mentioned this new topic of the aid program and lingo in Australia, value for money. And we, I think, really need a sophisticated debate about what informs that concept. Value for money is about the optimal use of resources to achieve the intended outcomes. It is about the optimum combination of costs and quality of the goods and services to meet the needs of beneficiaries. It is not just about lowest cost. And we really affirm that direction in the government's response, where they say the value for money perspective focuses on results and returns for poor people rather than just input costs. And I think the first thing we must state is that change that builds human dignity and human development for the better are crucial factors in the definition of value for money. I think you here at Lowy have a particular role to play in a more sophisticated understanding of value for money. Can we develop a model for aid effectiveness which not only considers value for money from a perspective of speed, efficiency and numbers reached, but also enables us to track the changes in terms of human dignity? Let me give one example. In 2009, we started partnering with a very small Karatos Samoa, a nascent civil society outfit within the Catholic Church. In September of that year, I participated in a workshop simulation on emergency preparedness. Our simulation was an earthquake and tsunami. The simulation was about 5 days before the devastating real event. Smaller investments in Karatos Samoa meant that this extremely well-networked organisation was within 6 to 8 hours of the quake with communities, moving people to higher ground and responding. By the end of that year, it was an agency with influential relations with government authorities in the quake response and in the rebuilding. A small investment that leveraged a network to make an effective response to those who were worst affected. Sandy's referred in the government response to a transparency charter. That may be a way forward for value for money. But to my mind, the foundational purpose of the aid program would see the definition of the Transparency Charter as articulated to date as inadequate. It's nice, but it's only a first step. At the moment, it's about Australian taxpayers. Where are the poor and where is our accountability to them? Finally, as Sandy referred to with a bit of a different tone of voice, the concept of partnerships in the aid program. An obvious partnership group identified in the review and the response are the NGOs and civil society organisations. And I should first, as a good Catholic, accuse myself of sin. Yes, there is a financial benefit for Karatos and other NGOs in this, but truly it's not about the cash alone, although the cash will make a difference. Why is it something larger? Partnerships with NGOs can be more about the opportunity for leverage and legitimacy, as I've said about Karatos Samoa. Churches, other faith-based organisations, other civil society outfits have a constituency that they can meet beyond those of governments. We can link multilaterals and bilaterals to the grassroots. We can leverage change. Ashdown, in his report, said in 2008 NGOs spent $5.7 billion on humanitarian assistance. NGOs have large programs in affected countries before disasters strike. They have experience in resilience. They have an experience in community-based disaster risk reduction. And many work with national and local organisations. Ashdown pointed to the Karatos network. Its voluntary spend in 2006 was equivalent to the bilateral humanitarian assistance of Sweden, the 6th largest OECD donor. Whilst individual NGOs, governments and research institutions struggle to address enormous challenges such as the slow onset of drought or global pandemics, investing in these networks can bring about transformational results. And the other part of the partnership, as Sandy alluded to with NGOs, is our connection to the Australian community. For Karatos, that's an outreach each day to 630,000 students in Catholic schools, to the 3 universities, to the 44 hospitals that the Church runs in this country. It brings the voice of the Australian public to aid and also brings the voice of the aid endeavour to the public. And we do these things often with government. At the moment, we start a new program with AusAid on Africa, where in Western Australia we involve the University of Notre Dame in research, but also in teaching in African studies and research. So I'll leave my comments there. I've probably breached the 10-minute rule as well. Thanks, Annmaree.
Thanks very much, Jack. And now I'd like to ask Rowan Callick to come to the podium. Rowan is the Australian's Asia Pacific editor. He was the paper's Beijing-based China correspondent for 3 years before moving back to Melbourne at the start of 2009. Rowan's history in journalism is I think well known to all of us. He's won 2 Walkley Awards for Asia Pacific coverage. He's won the Graham Perkin Award for Journalist of the Year. His credentials are very, very solid, and I'd like to ask him to come and speak to us now.
Thanks, Annmaree. My role today will be the bad guy. Question, how will the future shape of the world shape Australia's aid program? Of course, hides a far more difficult question than our mere consideration of an aid program. What will the future shape of the world be? I'm afraid the world is a bit beyond me. I'll leave Africa, the Middle East and Latin America to one side, rather perplexed as to why we should be spending there, where our expertise and experience are modest at best, and where massive amounts of European and American aid have tended to be so notoriously counterproductive. But in our own Asia-Pacific region, I'll hazard that the East Asian pattern of steadily growing prosperity will keep spreading, both geographically and within nations, while large pockets of poverty persist within those countries for a considerable time. Pacific Islands, meanwhile, will suffer from the tyrannies of distance, of education failure, especially about pathways to economic success, and also, I'm afraid, from surfeits of aid, that classic drug of dependence. The aid review did an excellent job, but it was hamstrung, I believe, by the restrictive terms of reference, which rather funneled it towards politically desired conclusions. Its objective was to examine the effectiveness and efficiency of the Australian aid program and make recommendations to improve its structure and delivery, unquote. It wasn't asked to consider the basic questions. Why aid? Does aid, leaving aside disaster relief, which is not necessarily, though of course it can be related to development, does aid actually do good? And secondarily, how much aid money can the federal government usefully and accountably manage in this sphere, while at the same time our diplomatic capacity is continuing to be cut back? Unsurprisingly, given those restricted terms of reference, the ensuing debate over aid has been distinctly muted. Indeed, many of the entries to the official online debates about the review were somewhat embarrassingly bald requests for handouts. Rightly, the petitioners were anticipating that not much was going to stop the cash coming, and that there will likely be something for almost everyone. The Lowy paper correctly points out that countries in our region have achieved stunning economic successes that offer an alternative model for developing countries. It's especially interesting not only that they have, quotes, lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty without slavish adherence to the policy strictures of the Washington Consensus, close quotes, if such a beast can be identified today, but that they have done so without significant recourse to aid. There were aid programs of sorts in Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, but in a very modest way. The following round of success stories, Malaysia, Thailand, today also Vietnam and Indonesia, have been more substantial aid recipients, especially Indonesia, but the common factor throughout is that these economies have become outward-looking, have fostered significant investment rates, and have conceded the social and cultural compromises necessary to harbour the kind of sustained growth that brings with it jobs and better living standards and hope. That is the way to make poverty history. 50 years ago, at the time of Kenya's independence, South Koreans were on average poorer than Kenyans. Today they're almost 30 times richer. North Koreans were also better off than their poor southern cousins. The number one development challenge is for other countries to consider what they might most effectively learn from such success stories and how to apply it. Yet spreading such success stories is not a significant part of our aid program. How have we helped Pacific Islanders to relate more constructively with their Asian neighbours, who comprise the dominant potential markets for their goods and services? What kind of a priority has that been for us? Are we helping build Asia literacy in the islands? Can we find a way to work in the broader region with counterparts from Japan, Korea, India, China and Taiwan? The pattern now laid down is to deploy increased funding through multilateral agencies. Yet, as the Lowy Review points out, today we're facing a malaise of multilateral institutions. This being said, I'd like to note an important exception. Bob Zellick, the Managing Director of the World Bank, wrote a piece in our paper a few days ago that boasted that his organisation was becoming, quotes, the driver of a new interconnection between multilateral aid for results and private investment, close quotes. He especially focused on the International Finance Corporation's backing for the expansion, though he didn't name the company, of Irish-owned Digicel through the region, pointing out that in countries such as Tonga and Vanuatu, mobile phone usage rates have increased from 6% to 60% of the population. I can testify that in Papua New Guinea in a recent visit, it became clear to me that Digicel was transforming the social and economic opportunities for people not only in towns but in villages too. I received yesterday an email from a PNG friend who said, Digicel have just received 3 more licences, so they're really ploughing ahead. PNG has a lot to thank Digicel for. Working with such companies is a great way to help underwrite and speed the push towards long-postponed prosperity in places like PNG. So is working with that country's most successful economic sectors, mining and agriculture. The Lowy paper says, the private sector, with sufficient incentives, is able to reach areas that government cannot and provide services to the poorest communities in many developing countries. How is our aid program going to facilitate more spin-offs and more sustainable spin-offs from commercial, predominantly resource-focused investments in our region? This will seem to require quite a cultural change within AusAid. How will this be achieved? Many in the business community operating in developing countries in our region have tended to view AusAid as part of their problem rather than part of their solution. I haven't mentioned the more traditional spending of aid on welfare in the broadest sense, which is where the greatest proportion tends to go. There's an increasing readiness on the part of government aid bodies like AusAid to deploy non-government organisations to deliver such spending. Perhaps we need to invent another phrase to describe organisations which actually depend, and indeed seek to depend, increasingly on government income and which devote considerable resources to lobbying for increased government spending in the sector. The quantums now involved can imperil at the same time as empowering NGOs. As Jack just said, good aid is not necessarily expensive aid. In PNG, AusAid is focusing more clearly on education, especially on supplying basics, including textbooks, and on healthcare, ditto with medicines. In Indonesia, AusAid has been building large numbers of schools, programs I would support. But the moral hazard this creates, of course, is that the rulers of such countries will thus feel free of the need to deploy funds to such purposes and can continue to divert them, some inevitably falling into their own pockets. There's no easy way out of this if we're not to penalise the poorest among our neighbours, though it's naturally immensely frustrating to see aid simultaneously helping to enrich further the elites. The answer may well be that we take on certain responsibilities on an open-ended basis, as we've been doing with Ramsey, which has brought welcome stability and administrative continuity to Solomon Islands. Making sure the recipients understand this process will also serve an educated purpose in governance terms. And Sandy has already mentioned the concept that we will have to keep spending on some of those basic services in the islands. Often small programs that involve close people-to-people links are the most effective, as Jack said. But AusAid's own cost structures have been such that it's found it too expensive to administer such small amounts, even to religious and or community groups in the region. As a result, our diplomatic posts continue to be besieged by local groups making modest demands on their limited discretionary funds. Lowy's latest poll on attitudes to international issues shows that on average Australians believe that we spend 16% of our annual budget on foreign aid. A long way ahead of what we're actually spending, of course, but which they would like reduced by a quarter to 12%. The most important aspect of that extraordinarily wrong assessment is that people would rather we spent less, not more. Nevertheless, within the aid sector itself, underlying the attitude to aid, both publicly donated from taxes and privately from fundraising, subscription and other philanthropy, is the assumption that the more money we spend in this aid field, however loosely defined, poverty will be diminished. But public policy reforms can in some areas achieve more palpable results with modest, if any, outlays. Remittances, for example, comprise a considerable development tool. Yet we appear incapable in Australia of providing a workable program such as New Zealand has built for having workers from the Pacific come here. Our pilot program has all but petered out. I'm certainly a believer in charity. For a decade, while I was living in Papua New Guinea, I struggled with overseas donors to help keep afloat a range of development-focused and local church-owned publications in English and Tolpisin, often having to adapt to our donors' swift-changing priorities. And look at the way in which Rotary has led the way towards the elimination of polio. And we must fund safety nets for our own disadvantaged citizens. But can our government or its agents reach out to deliver charity effectively in other countries? I'd like to believe so. It's just that the evidence is not, to me yet, utterly convincing, or convincing enough to double our spending without considering these bigger questions. Look at PNG, more than $10 billion spent there since independence on aid, but it remains anchored at 139th, near the bottom of the UN's Human Development Index. Finally, the imperative for whole-of-government policy making, as Lowy puts it, in this area, risks being undermined by the political responsibility for aid being in the hands of a minister who, as in the present case, operates as a lone wolf. That underlines the need, alluded to but not endorsed by the Aid Review, for a discreet Minister for Aid. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rowan. And we started late today, so we'll be running a bit over time. And it's now an opportunity for those of you who can stay on for the next few minutes to ask some questions and have a bit of a discussion with our panel. I'd like to open up questions if anybody's got a questions from the audience. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thanks. I'd like to ask the panel, referring to Sandy's last comment about this bipartisan internationalist approach by Australia, and then taking some of Rowan's more hard-headed News Limited type views. How is it that there hasn't been a big debate about the extent of our aid budget, given that there are also issues quite frequently between the two parties about budgetary expenditure and so on? I think before the last election, Julie Bishop, of all people, managed to resist an attack from some of her colleagues on the aid budget to Africa. So how have we managed to dodge this, and is it going to come?
Sandy, would you like to?
Well, all I can say is that, well, perhaps a couple of comments would be useful. One is, it seems to me that we need to distinguish two related questions. One is a question of whether Australia should be spending a particular amount of money, let's say in 5 years' time, around $8,000 million per annum, on foreign aid, compared to other things on which one could spend part of $8,000 million. And I think that must always be considered, I mean, to state the blinding obvious, to be an absolutely legitimate issue that could be open to totally robust debate, and on which different people would have different views. I have my own views. It's not an issue that was in the remit of our terms of reference, but that is one question. Aid versus other calls on the taxpayer dollar. It's a significant and important question in my view when you're thinking of pushing aid up to 2% of the federal budget, the fastest growing area of budget. Now, on that matter, it seems that there is a solid bipartisanship as far as I can tell, and I guess we can only say that it's founded on all those years of commitment to UN targets which have been endorsed by governments, you know, and found their way into policy. So I think that perhaps that issue will, I think perhaps, John, that issue will just, you know, continue to be bipartisan. The second sort of issue is, are we spending on the right things in the right places effectively, and so on and so forth? I think my sense from our discussions with parliamentarians and the opposition as well as government is that they would think that the broad bulk of our assessment about that matter would be roughly right. But I certainly think, even if that's true, there is room for debate, at least around the edges, about where we act, what we do, and how we do it. And I would be, I suppose, slightly surprised if some debate of that doesn't occur, you know, in the period ahead. And indeed, to me, it would be, shall I state again the obvious, utterly healthy in a free democratic society that it should, where transparency, capacity for commentators, others, the public, to understand what's good and bad will be key to actually getting the job done. That's how you get effectiveness, is rigour and debate and self-criticism. So, sorry, that's a bit waffly, but that'd be my answer.
Did anyone else?
I'd just say on the robustness of the debate needs to happen on a continued basis. The NGO movement for the last 7 years has done a huge amount through its campaigns. The Churches Under Market Challenge, Make Poverty History, about a whole community education. I'd say parliamentarians on a frequent basis say to those aid campaigners, most of them volunteers, you know, we get lobbied at church meetings at every single place under the sun the last half dozen years about an aid program and aid budget, and that it should be growing and should be at world best practice, but it also should be an accountable one. So I'd say there's also a fairly consistent movement over half a dozen years on that as well.
My view is that there's somewhat of a misconception in the minds of many people that aid is about disaster relief. That's a wide view, and so people see tragedies, they see starving babies, and that's what they associate with aid spending. So who can deny, you know, that? Who's going to cause a baby to die, and so on? And I think this is part of the what will emerge. I think this is right. As we start to increase the amount that we're spending, surely people will start to move on. But I think that's the reason. For most people, when they're giving money to the charity of their choice, or they're lobbying their MPs, in many cases they're responding to a terrible need on their TV screen.
Thank you. Alistair G, Act for Peace, National Council of Churches. Thank you, Sandy. We very much welcomed the review. And in quite a few places within it, you talk of how it's the conflict-prone countries that will be left behind, and they're the ones in particular need of attention. And I think it's 57% of Australian aid currently goes to conflict-affected and fragile countries. However, by my calculations, only 0.6% of Australian aid that goes directly to programs that reduce violence. And this is something you talk in your report of donors tend to underinvest in programs that actively reduce violence. So I'm talking here of peace building, humanitarian disarmament and mine action programs. Is this something that came up in your deliberations, and is it something that you would support more of that investment?
I think the sort of straightforward answer to your question is that I don't recall in our deliberations on the panel a great deal of discussion about the specifics of the mines and the peace building and so on. We did talk a great deal on the panel about both fragile states and the need for focus there. We talked about we talked about issues of violence, including not just conflict violence, but for example, violence against women. That's that issue. And I think it would be fair for me to say on behalf of our panel that we would not be at all fussed and would probably welcome a more substantial slice of the increased amount that we suggest for humanitarian assistance going to what you're describing, subject to them being decent programs that are going to lead to some outcome. But we had an awful lot on our plate, and I can't honestly say it was discussed perhaps in the depth you would have wished.
I don't know if the 0.6% would include Ramsey, but in my view, you can see Solomon Islands, what's happened there, a big injection of funding, and that's a pretty broad spend. But if you go to Solomon Islands and talk to Solomon Islanders, I think you'll find that they feel that that has been a program very much for peace, and it's been a successful one.
I've got another couple of questions in front of me, but I'm just going to take the prerogative for a moment and put a question to the panel. Either all or one of you can answer this, and it's to do with the way in which the government has responded in terms of the role of women. And I suppose if I have a disappointment with the government response, it's that that whole area of women's role in development, it's absolutely essential and fundamental, seems to have been, if you like, demoted. It's gone from a principle to an action within a strategic goal. Do you think that the way in which the government is approaching that does resemble some sort of demotion, or am I just being hypersensitive?
Well, I suppose the government can speak for itself, but I can take a punt at speaking for it. I think it is the latter, with respect. And I think it is an important point. If there's anything in the report, or indeed in the government's response, which comes across as some demotion of the importance of women and gender as issues in the aid program, this would be absolutely contrary to the intention. Now, that's never to say that either the report or the response perhaps have brought out as clearly as they should have, but I can absolutely assure you that it was front and centre of people's minds, certainly on my panel, and I reckon it within the government too. We saw it as central. In our configuration of things, we had 4 themes underneath the theme of helping people. We saw gender as one of the issues that in fact related to each of those 4 themes. There was a strong view, for example, on our panel that gender should not just be put under the theme of enhancing opportunity, but gender also related to economic growth, private sector development, and all those other things that we talk about. We were very mindful, as I said, of the domestic violence issue, for example, in the South Pacific, the way that women are falling behind on the MDGs in many countries so close to our own, the role of women in development, and we do have a section in our report on women's issues. But perhaps I'll just finish with this as a more interesting comment. We also say in our report that Australia must be more robust, more upfront, more prepared to have the argument with other governments than it's been in the past. In other words, to say, look, this actually is important to us. In the design of these programs, it's important to us. And even if, in other words, not duck the issue where it's a hard issue, but take it on where it's a hard issue. So I'm sorry if it didn't come across clearly enough in our report, but I can assure you members of my panel would be horrified to know that it didn't come across clearly enough. We're strong on it.
I think the criticism of the ACFID grouping was that it wasn't strong enough in the government response particularly. It's there in the recommendations as cross-cutting, as you know, Annmaree, but as the fundamental driver in development outcomes, that was a disappointment. But, as the program is rolled out, we're still in a program, we're not starting anew. That with AusAid is still very strong, and what I've seen in the multilaterals and what I see in the NGOs is still a real strong driver in all approaches.
It's hard to know how to achieve results in this area. I mean, it can be no coincidence, I think, that many Pacific Island countries, poor governments, are places which have almost zero women in prominent places in public life, and just how to work with that. Papua New Guinea is probably letting slip the opportunity to have, even though it's appointed, 22 women MPs the next House next year. I don't know if we can make those sorts of political changes, conditional on those sorts of changes, but I completely agree with what the other panellists have said. We need to, if we can, make this explicit at the political realm.
Thanks a lot. We've got time for 2 more questions over here and over here, or 3, and then we'll have to call it quits. There we go. Thanks.
John Darwin. I find myself siding with Rowan. I really don't understand how the aid and NGO industry in Australia really has got such a bad name. I can understand that most people think that we're spending 16% because they probably think they'll probably group the Aboriginal people in the same group and the poor who will always be with us, in the same sense. But the nature of transparency, Sandy, you talked about improving transparency. I think somebody needs to do a process in which we examine what the aid is doing and how effective it is, and then translate that into talking to the Australian people in a way which doesn't talk down to them, but which is actually practical. I think there are so many doubts about the nature of the way the charity industry in Australia raises its money. I'm very sceptical about some of those methods, which seem expensive and ineffective, and the way there is this mixture between emergency aid, in which a lot of money is raised, and then that money is not actually spent on the emergency, but kept subsequently, like Care Australia did, for other purposes, however worthy those purposes are down the track, and then set that against the fact that China, without any aid at all, took 300 million people out of poverty. I mean, I think if there is a solid argument for the NGOs and solid argument for Australian aid, then to me it's not been made, and I just wonder how you might go about doing that.
I think we might take that one as a comment, if that's okay, because we're running out of time, and I think that could open up a huge... We've already
happy to have the conversation.
One other question down the back here, and then we've got one last one, and then we will have to wrap it up.
Thank you. Robin Fitzsimons. It's obviously a given that the primary purpose of aid is to benefit people's lives. That said, the question of the diplomatic consequences for the donor country is something that people always consider. You've talked about the outside world, both, and this I guess is directed particularly at Rowan Callick. China clearly uses aid as a diplomatic tool, particularly in this region. The United States, the Quadrennial Review, which I think was overseen by Annmaree Slaughter, talked about the upregulation of American aid, and particularly in relation to the Department of State. So my question is, how do you see the Australian aid effort integrating with those external forces? And in particular, the question of health diplomacy and health aid, which I gather has been a particularly effective domain for Australian effort in the region. Where do you see that going?
Rowan?
How does aid relate to our diplomatic priorities? I guess we're wanting to live in a prosperous and secure world, and that's really the answer. And we ideally, if aid can be a tool for achieving that, then that's another part of what we're aiming to achieve through our diplomacy as well. I guess that's probably the best answer that I can give for that. Obviously, other countries have other aims. If I was China, say, famously is particularly concerned about resource security, and its diplomacy is very focused on achieving secure access to resources it needs to keep fueling its own economic prosperity, and we can see that in the way that Chinese diplomacy works here, let alone in Africa and other places. I guess in our own case, Annmaree has worked at senior level at AusAid. You know whether it's a question of whether AusAid people feel they're a sort of separate silo within the embassies or high commissions in which they work, or whether they feel they're a fully integrated part of the team. It's an interesting question.
Last question, just here, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Jay Horton, Strategis Partners. My question is about the lessons that we might have learnt through the review from some of the private aid programs, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. So that's the question. Have we best practices that we can adopt?
Yeah. Speaking for the review, we spoke to the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and other major players who sort of emerged, I guess, on the international scene in recent times, and found it useful. I think that if you had to get down to two things that stick in my mind about what they said, they're unsurprising things. One was partnership, thank you very much, and it needs to be real partnership, not just you're the provider, we're the deliverer. It needs to be partnership from, and this applies to Karatos, by the way, and other organisations too, I think. It needs to be partnership of a new kind, almost from the policy formulation stage through program design, through preparation to execution, not just we're government, we know best, you deliver. That's one thought. The second was the focus on results. Just a very strong, as you'd expect, I'd almost say sort of private sector instinct to focus on outcomes, but that would be a little unfair because I think that within the NGO community and government too, there's a very strong focus on outcomes. It's just they're damn hard to measure sometimes in this field.
Okay, I'd like to wrap it up there, and if you would join me in thanking our three panellists, Sandy Hollway, Jack de Grute and Rowan Callick. Thank you.